Big welcome everyone to the third seminar in the Just Tour seminar series, Unsettling the Human, More Than Human Provocations for Justice in Tourism. My name's Anna de Jong and I'm going to be moderating today's session. And today we're going to be exploring how we challenge the centrality of humans when we think about justice in tourism. The origins of justice thinking came about through concerns for thinking about citizens' rights in judicial systems. As a result, the theoretical and philosophical ideas that have come to tourism are often human-centric. So today we're going to be considering the various theoretical underpinnings that we might draw on to unsettle this justice human-centric discourse, thinking of framings such as posthumanism, new materialism, and theories of effect. We're also going to be thinking about the methodological complexities that we might encounter through more than human framings in just ways. To explore this, we're very lucky to have today some of the leading thinkers, four of the leading thinkers in this space, Lucia Tomasini and Ian Lamond, who are going to be presenting first together. Then we'll have Michaela Stinson, and then finally Anna Claudia Martini. And each of our four speakers is really united in recognising this need to go beyond the human and go beyond discourse through their research, yet they take quite different approaches methodologically and theoretically. But really today what we hope to consider is the way that actually the four speakers are united in advocating for cross-species justice and the rights of non-humans in the spaces and places of tourism. So we'll have our three presentations from the four speakers first up, and then we'll move to an activity that will be facilitated by Lucia and Ian before finally moving on to some questions and answers. As the speakers share their thoughts today, please feel free to use the chat function at any time to share your own thoughts, reflections or questions, and we can collate these for the presentation, for the question and answers at the end. So moving to introduce our first speakers, Lucia Tomasini and Ian Lamond. Lucia is a senior research lecturer at NHL Stenden University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and Ian is an independent researcher. And together, Ian and Lucia draw on posthumanist philosophy to reconsider tourism space as relational, rich and heterogeneous, rather than something that can be reduced to a singular narrative. And they use these relational ideas to really consider how justice isn't so much about people or individual or community well-being, but actually is about otherness and otherness for humans and non-humans. So a warm welcome to Lucia and Ian. I'll pass over to you now to share more about your perspectives and approaches in this space.
Oh. Thank you. I mean, we were intending to begin by introducing ourselves. I think you've beaten us to the post there.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Exactly. So done. Check.
So how it comes.
So Ian, basically we can move the slides on our own here.
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how I do that.
Oh, I can do it. If you click on the slides, and basically there is an arrow that appears, and then you move it. Or I can do it for you. So if you want,
yes, please. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, I can't see an arrow. Anyway, hello. So, welcome everyone. We wanted to begin by just sort of outlining some of the context in which our thinking and our perspective has been growing and emerging. It's an ongoing project. And most of what we're doing is still very tentative as we explore the terrain that we're trying to navigate. But it's grown through a number of concerns and issues that we both share when it comes to mobility justice, to mobilities more broadly, and to tourism and events. I've used a quote to head the slide from Christopher Nolan's film The Dark Knight, part of the Dark Knight trilogy, which is a line used by the Joker just before the Joker performs some kind of atrocity, which is why so serious. And I use that because these are serious things, and there's a concern that we as humanity are smiling our way into atrocity, where we need to be confronting those problems and those issues. And so they're around the concern that as tourism has grown, as it's developed, as it's become embedded within industrial capitalism, and as we move towards a concept of economic growth that is about consumption and ever increasing consumption, we are having to consider the value system, the axiology that we have that needs to be wider than the anthropocentric roots that we have traditionally considered ethics within. If we think about such things as utilitarianism, they tend to be from a humanocentric position, an anthropocentric position. So we need to now, because of the breadth and the extent of the concerns that we're facing and having to contest, having to look beyond those anthropocentric models. This means challenging historical binaries such as the host and the guest, the visitor and the resident, and looking at how we can, what frameworks and structures and models are going to be of value when we consider tourism ethically, and what ethics means for mobility and tourism. And we've done that through an ongoing project. And what we're hoping to share with you today is just a couple of those aspects of the work we've done and how that work has evolved over time. Yeah.
Okay, so I move on from here, and thank you, Ian. So, yeah, as Ian introduced, let's say, our presentation, and also beautifully Anna did, I mean, we will share with you reflections. So let's say in the form of a question, but actually they are reflection, and probably we have more question and answer, as you would imagine, on such a complex topic. But this is, let's say, our journey, and we're in the middle of that. So trying to look at how we can rethink the space of tourism through the lens, I mean, for the sake of more than human justice. So, I mean, exactly, I mean, this kind of post-human lens that allows us to think on a space that is not by definition anthropocentric, and a tourism that is not by definition anthropocentric. So in this reflection, exactly, well, you see that we have the prompts of some comics, but, well, we move on from the slides. Here are some images. Seems we all, I guess, in different parts of the world, we are familiar with this kind of, let's say, sentiments or reactions or way of framing tourism as sort of an injustice toward the residents, or unwanted activities, or this tension in between locals and tourists. I mean, so this is, I mean, these images refer, maybe you may recognize some of them, I mean, capitals, European cities, from Barcelona to Amsterdam, till going to Australia, where there is a reaction toward tourism as considered something largely unjust in many of his, so to say, practices or impacts, so to say. So when we, I move on to the other slide. So when we were, I mean, in our attempt to rethink the space of tourism through the lens of justice and posthumanism, so more than human space and tourism, we were, so to say, drawing or use space theory from the Reed Massey. So we were actually deeply reflecting, or we were probably charmed by the idea of space as an open space, as a relational space. I mean, from the capitalism type of, let's say, economics and mechanism, and even previously, I mean, space has been largely conceived as a surface to transit, as something like as a surface or a box, so to say, something, while actually we like to think or to open up the reflection on space by looking at how relational it could be open. I mean, that is actually the type of relationship, network, events or activities, and connection between different type of actors or actant, as the tool would say, make the space lively. So it's not just a static given thing, but is always changing, always, I mean, made by this relationship. So bringing this type of reflection of space together with concepts like field theory from Lewin, and also post-human, let's say, type of reflection, we see as possible theoretical framework or way of conceptualizing just space, I mean, for a just tourism to happen, as well, it's not an equation, let's call it, let's say, conceptual model, but sorry, I mean, I know that sounds a bit scary in the question here, but this was our way of visualizing it. So, I mean, we have to think through the lens of, let's say, an affective type of relation of tourism. So a sort of affective posthuman ethics is what would bring to a just tourism. And this is a function of the relationship between the actants, the actors, and the relational spatiality. So the interplay between a multiplicity of actors, actants, and a relational space who can create the basis, who can lead towards a tourism which is grounded in an affective posthuman ethics. And that leads to justice in terms of positive bonds in a constructive shared project and vision. So not being kept together by fears or problems, but actually by a collective vision and way of staying together, which is a so to say witness and staying also with the problem of staying together. And this is, let's say, the first reflection that we wanted to share with you. And I then give back the floor to Ian and I move to the next slide.
No, if we keep with that one just for a second, please. Okay,
yeah.
just to underline the difference between Levine's and our formulation. Levine was very much seeing the function being between the person and the environment. So it was very very anthropocentric. It was also very positivist. But what we were trying to do, which is why we called it a conceptual model rather than an equation, is that the A and the S for us are co-constitutive. It's not that you put a function between them. It is that they co-create themselves. So it's a dynamic relationship. So if we can now move on, please.
Thank you, Ian. Okay.
Thank you. So having made that initial position, we wanted to extend it and look at mobility a little bit more as well, and how things transit spatially and temporally. So that's where we move to next on our ongoing journey. So we began to rethink not just space and spatiality as we had done previously, but also mobility as well. Next slide, please. So here are some images to show various mobilities and immobilities of non-human animals and how they are affected by an anthropocentric framework. So we have in one, we have a kitten who is being either taken away on holiday or is being housed while the humans go on holiday. In 2 and 3, we have animals who are in a state of immobility while mobile, as they are used as product, as they are being used for consumption. And in 4, we have some beluga within a water pen who are there, yes, possibly for some conservation work, but essentially for human entertainment. So the mobilities of these non-human animals are framed and structured through the power relationships of their relationships to humans. And next. So we tried to embed this within the next stage of our thinking, having considered the framework for space as F bracket AS, so the actant and the spatial, as in a functional relationship. We now started to layer into that the idea that these things change over time, T. They evolve, they adapt, they get constructed in different ways. But what is one of the main factors that is impacting that is the ability to move. What is controlling the ability to move? Who holds the power when it comes to that capacity to move? For most of the natural world, most of the fauna of the natural world, that capacity to move is biologically based. But as we look at things through a lens of social justice, we become more and more aware of the human intervention within that. Even if it's for something such as the reintroduction of lynx into various areas in Scotland, the abilities to manage that spatial movement, temporal movement, is very much an anthropocentric mode of thinking, and that then impacts how ethics are considered when we're trying to understand what is just and right for these particular contexts. So I think that's that equation. Again, not an equation, it's more about the functional associations and interrelations between the factors. Lucia, do you want to come in?
No, yeah, exactly. But do you mean for the next slide or comment on that one? Sorry.
Well, if you want to comment on that one, fine.
No,
but
exactly.
Move on.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add, and thanks for that, exactly. And I hope exactly that the audience could follow us in this exactly reasonings, but would be nice then hearing from the Q&A and exactly how this you react to our reflections.
Okay. So what we had was a model that basically indicated the factors and the associations and the interrelations and the entanglements that we need to consider if we want to discuss the ethics of mobility or the ethics of space when it comes to tourism and to travel. But what we haven't got in there is how we've got the factors for thinking ethically, but how are we to think ethically? And in that, we draw quite heavily on one of the leading exponents of postmodernist ethics, which is Rosi Braidotti. And in our next slide, we just have a series of quotes drawn from several of her works to try and encapsulate what that is, because unlike a lot of traditional ethical perspectives, which are very anthropocentric, they are also forms of calculus where you are intended to calculate what the correct action is, rather than trying to see the multiplicity of potential ethical narratives that could be generated. And it's that multiplicity also that is important to bear in mind, because now contexts are so complex, we need to be aware of the variety of voices that are debating that space, that movement, so that we can come to a more thoughtful and reflective and responsible response to those issues.
Yeah, and if I can add a bit on that, I think exactly that, well, as you can imagine by the many quotes and probably also from the whole presentation, exactly Rosi Braidotti, not wholly Rosi Braidotti, but her way of looking at post-human approach through these nomadic subjectivities. I mean, tourism is basically a sector, an industry, but also, I mean, a cultural phenomenon that is, so to say, ancient from many aspects, but also, I mean, in his more classical formulation, is more recent and is deeply embedded in this duality, host and guest, visitor, and this kind of different gazes. So it's to some extent also the word tourism is a bit âgé, I mean, in my perception. So I think embracing this idea of these nomadic subjectivities of a space that open up, where actually we are all in the relationship with the other, is a different way of looking at tourism as actually an activities where you move along a line, an itinerary, and you look at an otherness that could be a cultural or geographical difference or another species, basically. So I think this is where we see the room to keep on the reflection for thinking space, the touring space in the post-human.
I think ultimately the work we're doing is to just continue exploring. I don't think we've reached any absolute decisions on anything, but journeys are important, and by keeping on a journey, then hopefully we throw up new ways of thinking, new ways of looking, new ways of being.
Yeah. Do you want me to move on with the slides so we
please.
Yeah.
We just have a couple more.
Yeah, basically we are at the end, just for the sake of time, exactly. But Ian, do you want me commenting that, or you want to?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the slide here, we've just got some examples of where individuals and organizations have tried to explore some of that co-creativity and that being with in terms of the mobility offer that they're presenting.
Yeah, so these are exactly example of projects. Exactly, you may recognize some of them, but exactly we don't. One is a startup, Science Planet, and the other is the Route Guide, which are actually here in the Netherlands, and then Migrant Tour, which is an European project. And then move on to the next slide, since I hope we are good with the timing. And this is just, I don't know, since we both like movies, and I suspect we're not the only one here, but so just, I mean, a selection of movies that, in our opinion, were reflecting, let's say, this idea of a posthuman space and a search for posthuman justice in tourism. I don't know if you're familiar with some of these titles. Triangle of Sadness is about a luxury cruise line and very disruptive, let's say, situation that happened. And then Io, the one with the donkeys, is a road movie where the center of the main actor, the main character. So all the movies through the perspective of this donkey who came across a human society while he's traveling, and with a bit of candide, bad and good situation. And then on the top and on the bottom left is Flow. That is about this kind of is a recent one. I think he also won something on Cannes, but it's about this journey in a posthuman world, in the meaning that survivors are all animals, all non-human animals, and they are navigating through the remains of the human society. So mobility, touring somehow. So I think that we're nice way of concluding. Ian, give back to you.
No, I think we can move on. So I'm sure we'll have questions and comments after everyone's presented, and then we've also listed a few references that we've used. We're particularly thankful to We Animals Media, who let us use the images of the non-human animals that were presented in the mobility section of our slides. So a big thank you to them.
Yeah, and I think this is the end for us. So thank you all for listening.
Oh, a huge thank you, Lucia and Ian. I really valued hearing that conversation, having read your work. I think it was really nice to see it articulated as a dialogue between the two of you. And also, I really value the cultural references, the media, films as well. I think it can be quite nice to consume and try to understand the importance of these ideas through various formats, and always through the written word, which
a lot of what Lucia and I do, and and people listening is around convivial conversations between us and seeing what emerges from those conversations, rather than having a definite project in mind.
And I think that speaks so much to the philosophy that you're drawing on, doesn't it? Right, just that importance of having things open and thinking about those possibilities as a way to remove from a step away from these kind of reductive binaries. So I really value that. And I should have mentioned at the start, we're recording this and it'll be available, so we can kind of reference back. If you didn't get an opportunity to note down those references and films there, thinking back of what he said there.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much to Ian and Lucia. Feel free in the audience to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we can return to them at the end. So now I'll move to introducing our second speaker today, who is Michaela Stinson. Michaela is an independent scholar and has recently completed a PhD at the University of Waterloo in Canada. So a huge congratulations to Michaela today. Michaela's PhD engaged with new materialist approaches to explore the production and maintenance of political and structural formations at Niagara Falls, as well as how these formations can become unsettled or are unsettled. And Michaela today is specifically going to be thinking through the methodological complexities that were encountered through this new materialist lens that was drawn on, where it was attempted to bring together the role of story, sounds, objects and effects in producing, maintaining and unsettling place. So a warm welcome and congratulations, Michaela, and I'll pass the floor over to you.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Anna. That makes it sound a little more recent than it was last year, but I appreciate it anyway. Thank you for letting me be here today. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and to get to hear the work and think with Ian and Lucia and Anna, and thank you to everybody behind the scenes. This is very amazing. I'm admittedly a nervous speaker, so I always put that out there, that stumblings are part of my vibe, and I appreciate your patience with that. So as Anna introduced, I'm Michaela, more commonly MK. I'm coming to you right now as an independent scholar, as somebody whose affiliation is in transition. I'm sure many of you have been there. And I'm going to talk a bit today through some of the research I was involved in during my time as a graduate student at the University of Waterloo. All of my projects, as kind of was mentioned, engaged new materialist or actor network informed, more than human style research orientations, generally around a politics of criticality, relationality, and unsettling, as I flagged in my slide here. I need to say that so much of this work and my thinking has been scaffolded by the mentorship of Dr. Brian Grimwood, who was my PhD supervisor, consistent beacon of care and compassion and incredible contributions to my thinking. And a lot of my thinking and research has been bettered and made less lonely as well by the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Hurst, now at Northumbria, as well as Dr. Kelly Caton at Thompson Rivers University. So I've called this talk Unsettling Methodologies, but the subtitle could be things like Working Chaotically with New Materialism, or maybe Continual Messes with Actor Network Theory. I'm mostly going to talk very quickly through how I approach new materialist work, and then I'm going to give a bunch of different examples of so-called unsettling methodologies, which range up and down in a few different ways. So as many of you probably know, and as Lucy and Ian kind of set us up for, new materialisms are a complexity of theories. They're not just one thing, but many things. But most of them have a similar number of orientations and aims and arise from a contextualized critique that kind of says that scholarship in general hasn't taken seriously enough the power of matter. So this is similar again to posthumanisms, kind of looking at things that are not human and other kind of ideas like that. They, like other kind of theories in the wheelhouse, challenge dualist thinking and binaries, including that of the human and non-human divide. They orient towards an agency that isn't just of the human. They're generally concerned with futurity and with possibility. They're historical, political, and also critical. And I think they should come with an interrogated positionality and some like reflexivity about their citational politics, like where some of the ideas might have come from in other bodies of work, specifically bodies of work on Indigenous relational theories. So my summary is that I tend to think about new materialisms as tending to 5 concerns. And these concerns are critique, feminisms, agency, relationality, and transformation. And I believe also that when practiced responsibly and justly, they are unsettling. But to get to what I mean by that, we first have to go to Niagara Falls. So I live and work in Niagara Falls. It's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and it's been under their stewardship for thousands of years, and now is as well. It's also one of the world's most infamous tourist destinations, known as the site of the iconic Horseshoe Falls, kind of visible in this image here, and also the place that tourism began in North America, according to Patricia Jason. The Canadian city attracts about 13 million tourists a year as the site of the world's most commercialized waterfall. But Niagara Falls is also like pretty weird. It has a reputation of being tacky and kitschy and a little bit off kilter. There's something happening here, as Kathleen Stewart might say. The maintenance and construction of the falls is mundane, emergent, relational, and persistent, as well as spectacular. There's a lot of stories wrapped up in its iconic symbols and signs, and there's numerous more than human forces at play. There are myths and magic, so to speak, and there are hazy materialities that bring into being certain types of tourism, while others are frustrated and suppressed. And it is not just people that do this. The moment I got here, I was hooked. I wanted to understand how tourism was made in this city because I felt it obviously just wasn't something spectacular. It was very ordinary as well. So in the early days of March 2020, I was finishing up my PhD coursework and I was preparing to do a research project for my dissertation. I was interested at the time in looking at how Niagara Falls was made by and through sound, kind of a soundscape style approach. But instead, obviously we got a worldwide shutdown. And so I was a bit lost and dejected, and I started spending a lot of time wandering around the city, which was obviously very empty, as we can see in this shot. And I spent a bunch of time especially hanging out with this abandoned IMAX building. It was comforting to me to be here in the presence of this entity, this lonely, weird pyramid, as somebody who was also feeling a little bit lonely and weird at the time. And I decided I'd move from considering tourism largely to completing a project about this building. It seemed more feasible. I was going to think through the history of the building, think through how it contributed to tourism in the falls, which at the time was a natural extension from some of my prior actor network informed work on other types of tourism objects, including climbing bolt hangers and totem poles in Algonquin Park in Canada. Then they tore this building down too. So now I was plagued with a doubly laden question: how to study something that no longer existed 2 times over, first tourism and now the building. And I ended up dragging out of this mess a number of both traditional and somewhat untraditional research practices, many of which I include under this banner of unsettling research. So The first node of unsettling is unsettle the idea of what your object of research is in the first place. I remained more interested than ever in tracing how this IMAX kind of contributed to the making of falls over its lifespan. But to attend to a now absent object, I had to get creative beyond these site visits from when it existed and then when it didn't exist. Well, I didn't know what exactly I was researching. How does a building become a building in the first place? Now, the answer is land. Despite the IMAX's absence, I was able to trace it and its location all the way to the very first cordoning of land in Niagara Falls. And of course, there are maps to this effect. And these are some of them that refer to the location of the building as well as its first mortgages. So before there was the IMAX, there was land. And so here I want to get into the second orientation to unsettling. I want to be clear that this is a word that I wield dually. On one hand, it's taken up in the sense marked in the title of kind of this whole seminar. Disrupting, disturbing, or churning up taken for granted notions of what things are and why they are the way they are. But in the Canadian context where I live and work, unsettling has a built-in reference to land relationships and the very material conditions of life in and with our Earth, human and non-human. This word comes up in direct relation to the structures of settler colonialism that are fulsomely engaged in tourist practices, including those tourism practices that happen in Niagara Falls, Ontario. And these are structures that have currently and historically inflicted and continue to inflict profound violence onto Indigenous peoples, lifeways, and the environment in Canada. These maps, then, they are an express and material assertion of settler colonialism in Canada. In order for the IMAX to be made and then disrupted, first land was turned into property. The IMAX was built on land that has been used for a number of tourist purposes over the years, ranging from multi-carnival attractions to a failed speculative utopian city. But all of this, its existence, relied on the usurping of land in the first place, and it all relied on settler colonialism. In my desperation to locate this materiality of this building, and before I came across these settler maps, I also tried to make my own maps. A map is, of course, a performance, and it's a sedimentation of a certain type of reality. This is one that is usually informed by normative structures and city plans and codes and forms, as we see on the one side of the screen here. But mappings can also be exploratory, they can be experimental, and they can be provisional, as they're inherently a performative practice. As Knight says, if mapping is performative, then it can be used for other performances of reading the land, or, in my opinion, I think making the land. They're ethically important, and maps are a way to world less common representations. So the IMAX isn't just the IMAX. It's everything that it allowed it to become the IMAX, and some other things, and maybe something else, depending on how we orient to it. So this is the second node of unsettling. Like map making, research is world making. Methodology itself is world making. They both structure and condition everyday rhythms and experiences, including, yes, how settler colonialism is maintained. It is, as Robinson says, not merely the product of interpolation by the state, but formed and maintained through the rhythms of everyday practice. And this means that any everyday practice, be it walking, listening, researching, map making, can either reify or unsettle settler colonial modes of thought or other normative modes of thought. This includes, of course, methodology research and new materialist theory at large. There are no research practices or ideas that automatically release settlers in Canada from the potential construction of colonial knowledge. Turning away from normative modes of research making, like those that are common in new materialist or more than human work, doesn't inherently make these practices unsettling. They can contribute to, as I've talked about, the establishment and maintenance of these structures or their disruption. But the point is, I think these are really good places that leave openings for us to try to do more of this unsettling work, perhaps more than some other bodies of research or theory. I tried in another project to locate some of these normative modes of establishing so-called settler atmospherics, some that you see here on the screen, the illumination of the falls, and how Niagara Parks enrolls the falls to generate collective feelings related to nationalism for Canadians or for truth and reconciliation via its everyday spectacle. But that brought me to another big challenge of this type of new materialist work, data. How do we engage with challenging types of data? How does one study a collective feeling? And while I tried to be indiscriminate with the type of data that shows up for me, the need to be discriminate also comes in too, because we have a responsibility in the research that we do to justice in part and to generative critique. I guess to take up Latour, are these data a matter of concern? And then if they are, how do we analyze them? So the third node of unsettling, it's not just the research object and not just the methodology, but also the data itself and its process of analysis, so to speak, that benefits from unsettling. Data can be anything: documents, traditional archival sources, or media sources, historic maps, property registers, or social media posts. But it can also be feelings, stories, tendencies, atmospheres, wanderings, grievings, and beings. This means that care and concern and our own felt experiences, our own felt affect, are part of the array of challenging data. And they should not be ignored as data, but something that informs what we consider our data to be and how we care for it. Much of doing kind of new materialist informed research, unsettling or otherwise, is a practice of being with an ongoing cascade effect of research choices. And this is something that I've tried in some of my writings with Dr. Brian Grimwood to be very direct about as I took up actor network theory in whatever messy way I did, recognizing that analysis is always already happening and we always already have feelings about it. Another example: if I only consult or engage in formal settler archives, such as those that are maintained by schools, states, libraries, and governments, what am I missing? What other archives exist? Many of my most intense and driving encounters with materials and materiality were those assembled in the informal archives. This includes posts on attraction review websites like the IMAX Theater, maybe like posts on Reddit, or maybe like a bunch of stuff strewn upon the street. It's strange to see the same things in the formal library archives as you see on the street years later. An archive isn't just one thing. And does analysis change if the structure of the archive is different? Now, these days, I'm taking my approach to unsettling work in kind of two directions that aren't at odds, even though they might seem at odds. I'm loosely calling these approaches infrastructural approaches and ambivalent approaches, both terminologies that come from reading Lauren Berlant, but are also taken up in social sciences through Anna Singh and Ruiz, and in tourism studies as well. On the infrastructural hand, I'm becoming increasingly more fixated and dedicated to undertaking a critical accounting of the maintenance of property and the construction of land in Niagara Falls, especially in a moment that's shaped by profound material precarity for people, environments, climates, and general more than human thriving. I'm interested in the agentic mechanisms of policies, bylaws, and other types of bureaucratic tools in physically and discursively shaping land access, and futurity. And these processes have a profound outcomes on the physical structures in Niagara Falls as not only a tourist destination, but a place of community thriving. Histories and stories show up here, including the relationship between lived communities and public memory, public discourse, and place stories and narrative. Changing the material landscape changes the types of access a community has to its stories. Plainly, this is seen in how certain areas raise histories, buildings, and monuments. But meaning in tourism places is also found in structures that aren't, marked as important solely by the state. And in the other direction, I'm more committed than ever to taking up effective atmospheric and non-representational methodological approaches, many which can be oriented through a deep commitment to felt ambivalence in the Berlantian sense as an inevitable condition of intimate attachment. This intensity of attachment recognizes that while our land relations are material, they're also affective. And these situated ways of being deeply affect our being in the research world. My previous and recent work with Dr. Chris Hurst is an example of some of this ambivalent work put into practice, although we theorize it here as a non-representational engagements with atmospheres via concepts like fidelity and reverberation that are felt in place. The point here is that philosophizing is not immaterial, right? It's demonstrative of an unsettling impulse, wherein our understanding of the world is brought down into everyday practices. So I'm going to conclude with a brief summary. First, I suggest that unsettling methodologies, whatever they are, might be most useful when undergirded or at least informed by a politics of unsettling in contexts where settler colonialism structures life and flourishing. That's part of justice for me in Canada. When none of the practices I've detailed today explicitly attend to the express material conditions of Indigenous sovereignty or resurgence in Canadian contexts, they participate in their limited way in the overall unsettling of tourism research broadly by advancing, hopefully, modes of research that respond to what Johannesson calls colonizing grand narratives of traditional science. I think this should also be the work of new materialisms. And second, Chambers and Bazindi urge the importance of epistemological decolonization in tourism research broadly. This is an imperative that I and my colleagues that I've mentioned today and others have tried to work towards alongside. If we want to look at how research is constructed in the Tourism Academy, there's a need to consider the wielding of research methodologies towards the maintenance of certain knowledges and worlds, right? So these types of situated and engaged methodologies allow certain possible material discursive realities, and they foreclose others, right? The research we do literally makes certain types of realities. My final note on unsettling is the responsibility piece. We must be engaged, attuned, and turn towards our responsibilities to unsettle these relationships, these material and discursive relationships to the world. And we can do important and mundane and partial work to unsettle traditional approaches to researching tourism with the intention of making different worlds, like to invoke Keith Hollinshead's world making. And this is about justice, right? So justice here and in new materialist work is about situating ourselves in this inevitable relation, in continuous relation with our environments, our communities, our ecologies, our politics, ourselves, the structures that inform them, to reflect on and work at looking about how we engage and unsettle our research objects, methodologies, and data. I want to quote from work I wrote with Dr. Brian Grimwood and Dr. Kelly Caton to end on what we might learn from, at the time, of Common Plantain, which is also known as white man footsteps, or kind of a naturalized but invasive plant to Canada. And we write in the paper that emergent possibilities for change are abundant, and potentialities for living otherwise can be found by attending carefully to the places in which we already find ourselves. I think that's like the best we can do with engaging justice through more than human work. Thanks.
Oh, thanks so much, Michaela. I really valued you taking on us that process that you went through as part of your PhD. And I think what really struck me is the connection that it had to Lucia and Ian's work in kind of setting this frame about thinking about possibilities, and then how you kind of did that in your own work in one way, and the kind of the considerations that had to come into being once you kind of went through that process to think about, am I kind of recreating, am I actually troubling the unsettling here, or actually how can I do that work? So it's really valuable to see that process unfold through what began with in some ways with a relationship with the building, with a kind of
absolutely, yeah. All with this like kind of deep. I can't even express how many papers I've now written about this IMAX theater that no longer exists, but there's this like genuinely and completely seriously like deep connection to this building that sort of undergirded like the entirety of this work, and just kind of one of those things that was in place in time and so effective, and something that I to this moment will never be able to explain probably.
Yeah, well, that's really quite provocative and a nice place to end. Thanks so much. We have
a
comment from Ian saying that was awesome. Thank you. So thanks so much, Michaela. And now I'll move to introduce our final speaker today. So a warm welcome to Anna Claudia Martini. Anna Claudia is a researcher at the University of Bologna in Italy, whose research in part focuses on post-disaster tourism in Japan. And particularly, Anna Claudia explores how effective relations between people and post-disaster places, but also between locals and international tourists, fosters understandings of injustices that came about in consequence of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. So a warm welcome, Anna Claudia. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you for having me here. So I'll wait for the PowerPoint. Here it is. Thank you. So this is actually something that tries to make sense of 10 years of data collection, fieldwork, and staying with communities in northeastern Japan after the 2011 disaster. I will find, yes. So I called it Tourism, Justice, and the Posthuman, Perspectives from Post-Disaster Tohoku, Japan. So just briefly, I will go quite fast. The red area that you see is Tohoku, so the northeastern part of Japan. And in particular, I work on the coastal area that was the most hit by the 2011 disaster, which for people who are not familiar with that, was a huge earthquake, a tsunami with peak of more than 20-25 meters in certain areas, and that alone caused 20,000 casualties. And then the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which is still impacting the landscape today after almost 15 years. So in working with post-disaster tourism, there were both opportunities and challenges in the 10 years of fieldwork and presence in Japan, coming and going in different fieldworks almost every year. I managed to understand how these communities were constructed, what they experience, and what their aspirations for the future is, in particular in terms of justice. So what I wanted to show you today is more of a genealogical perspective. So to show that, for example, issues of justice have not simply to do with the consequences of the disaster, but that the disaster itself made justices or injustices that had already been there in the communities for a really long time. The disaster just made them visible. So what do we do with that, and how are issues of justice articulated within post-disaster tourism? So I take a very empirical approach. I work starting not from theory, but from the specific context I am embedded in. So Northeastern Japan, and in particular, fishing communities or communities in which the main job is to cultivate rice fields. And I look at what is happening there. So the theoretical framework that I have used and that I want to use today comes from, of course, tourism studies as a tool to reframe issues of justice for the communities. One of the biggest surprises in my PhD was that I went there thinking of studying post-disaster tourism, but every time I tried to talk about tourism there, what was given back to me was like, we are doing tourism so that people can see that we are suffering and that we want justice because certain national or subnational institutions are not giving us what we ask for. And so tourism becomes a way to become visible, to have agency. So then I use to frame all of this affect studies in which affect is considered as lived connection to landscape through feelings at different intensities. And of course, affects can be individual, they can be collective, and they can resonate across people and groups. And then actually, when I talk about justice, I actually focus on a specific definition, or let's call it framework, within the studies that deal with justice, which is recognition justice. So recognition justice tries to go beyond distributive, restorative, or retributive forms of justice. So it's not simply about, okay, we have a disaster in my specific case, in the case I work with, let's distribute the money across different communities, but it has to do with decisions made on how protection is not just distributed, but perceived. So this comes from Iris Marion Young's book, Justice and the Politics of Difference. So how do we have justice and maintain differences between communities, between stakeholders, when we implement tourism? Is it enough to give money to communities, or should we frame justice in a broader way and make it so justice can be tied to visibility, to voice, to agency, and to local participation? So to say that is very easy and to do that is very difficult. I actually used ChatGPT to make some illustrations, or to have ChatGPT make some illustrations. And I want to start from the past of these communities to reach tourism today and its intersections with justice. So the first illustration is that of a rice field that in general Japanese culture is connected to life. Asian cultures tend to have rice as the main carbohydrates, let's say, and it's deeply entrenched with the life force of these communities. I use the rice field because Tohoku, the region I work in and the region that was the most impacted by the 2011 disaster, has actually quite a fraught history with rice fields. Indeed, this region historically has never produced rice, but because in medieval times and later on, it was considered an internal colony of Japan, so it was not itself part of the big centers that were located in the southern part, but was a region in which the centers went to ask them to cultivate something or to take their goods, to take their wood, to take their fish. And so Tohoku became a giant rice field in the past to produce rice for the centers. So this already shows the situation in these communities before the disasters, which is a situation of exploitation, marginalization, and a sense of powerlessness when it comes to the unequal relations with the center. So it has to do also with the vision of the countryside as a so-called furusato. Furusato is a Japanese word that means place of origin or old village, but it's more related to an affect actually. So it's not actually a real place. It's a place, an imaginary place that is a sort of cultural trope where one Japanese person can feel nostalgia for a past that never was, but that is an ideal past. So when we see Tohoku and its landscape, we see rice fields and ocean and nature. I don't want to generalize too much, but it's sort of landscape that is connected to this idea of furusato, of this origin place where the grandma and grandpa used to live and conduct a traditional, simple life. But this traditional and simple life needs to be complicated by, for example, these unequal relationships and the genealogies of these relationships, how from the past they are brought into the present and projected into the future. I'm saying this to come to the disaster. I will not tell again the story of the disaster because I think now 15 years later, more or less people have an idea at least of the Fukushima part of the disaster. But one thing that is also important to understand and that impacts tourism there is that these communities have a very deep bond with the ocean. Of course, the ocean is a core element of these communities. And in particular, what I have been told many, many times again, is that the ocean is part of land. There is no actual distinction between land and sea. They're both part of the broader community, and there is no border, no separation between this. This brings me to another, let's call it non-human element, that is that of seawalls. After the disaster, a lot of seawalls have been built by the government to protect the communities, or so the central government has said. So this has been done to prevent risk, but has actually become a big problem for these communities because it separates them from the sea. So where does tourism enter the picture in this situation? One thing that tourism has done, as I said, is to give people a voice, to make people in these communities storytellers. There is a specific word in Japanese which is kataribe, so to allow them to tell their story in their own voice to tourists, especially foreign tourists. And there is a special relation with foreign tourists because in Japanese culture, and again, I'm generalizing, so I'm very sorry for doing this, but just to understand the broader tendency for a Japanese person would be not to express negative feelings. But with foreign tourists, what is allowed is a sort of safe space in which even negative feelings are allowed, because the average Western tourist, let's say, will ask, aren't you sad? Aren't you depressed after what happened? And the Kataribe will feel able to express that trauma and to deal with that trauma. So in that sense, while I'm very critical about tourism as a global system, the small experiences of tourism in my fieldwork, what I gathered is that they can be extremely transformative for people, and they can give both locals and tourism a way to deal with traumatic experiences, with post-disaster experiences. And it can contribute, tourism can become a form of homemaking for communities. And of course, the people in those communities were there before, but after the disaster, affectively, there was a sudden sense of insecurity and a sudden detachment from one's own community. People did not feel at home anymore because they perceived this danger. But tourism, in a way, helped them narrate their stories and make sense of their community again, and also try to imagine a future for these communities that they had to narrate to tourists. So this is just a small story. I don't think I have much time left, so I will go fast. One story that sort of encapsulates this is the story of the baby oysters of Minami Sanriku, which I like to tell because they repeat this story every time I go there. So in building the seawalls, they discovered, the government officials discovered that some baby oysters, so imagine that after the tsunami, everything was washed away, also oysters and many types of shellfish. And these communities are the biggest producers of oysters in Japan. So they didn't have oysters anymore. They didn't know what to do to maintain their livelihood. And at some point in deciding where to build these walls, they saw that baby oysters were starting to grow again. And the government was kind of set on building the wall right there. But the community protested for years and so hard that in the end, the wall was built, but in a different position so that the baby oysters could grow. And this is a very simple story about a non-human element, but the way this story is narrated to tourists and the way the small baby oysters have become a sort of symbol of the agency of these communities and of the interrelation between the human and non-human element is very, well, it's very nice to see. Bird Rose would call it the shimmering oysters, so these multi-species encounters that give us a new perspective. So in that sense, I have not talked about posthuman, but as you might have noticed, all the images I put are of non-human element, and the stories relate to non-human element or more than human elements and expressions. So the oyster is part of the tourism textures of such towns. They sell oysters. Their tourism is based on food, and the oyster is the food they prepare. So it's this entanglement, this constant shifts in perspectives that give us a new understanding of what tourism could be at its best. And I conclude just with this last icon. This is another story that tells us something about how tourism is managed. So this is called the Miracle Pine. It's an illustration of the Miracle Pine. It used to be part of a forest of thousands of pines, but the tsunami washed everything away except this one because it was slightly taller and stronger, so it resisted. And it became a national icon of resilience, but at the same time, a haunted landscape. Why haunted? Haunted by the disaster, but also because the tree people can visit today in the town of Rikuzen Takata is not the real tree anymore. The roots of the tree actually, the tree died after the disaster because of all the salt water, but the community decided to reconstruct a fake tree because for them, the important element was not really, the tree itself and its materiality, but the metaphor it represented, the metaphor of resistance in the face of disaster and destruction, And in a sense, this tree that survived represents the communities itself and the fact that they will be able to survive. And just taking tourists there, this is the most famous icon of the post-disaster area. Taking tourism there allows community to tell the stories of survival. So in that sense, justice in a recognition justice frame, and just to conclude, lies in affective recognition, in the way people in the communities, Cataribe, can tailor storytelling and collective memory, and can utilize post-human and more than human entities to co-shape the process of tourism. And I just want to very much conclude by saying that even when we talk about post-human and about affect, tourism is always political, and it's always contested and an ethical terrain, as Ian and Lucia already said at the very beginning. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Oh, thanks so much, Anna Claudia. I think what really strikes me about your research is this deep connection these communities had to place, and how that was disoriented through the tsunami, and that role of tourism in offering those opportunities to work through that trauma. I think that's such an interesting and valuable perspective to see that role of tourism in a post-disaster setting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. For me, at the beginning, I was there to study tourism and trauma as a relationship. So the post-human came after, because they are so attached to their landscape, not just to the oysters or to the what we would call the nice elements of the landscape, but even for them, the opposition to the seawalls, for example, has to do with the fact that they want to maintain a relationship with the ocean, even if the ocean caused 20,000 casualties. So that's more important. And I'm working on this idea of living with vulnerability in a frame. Maybe what we perceived as a danger in the short term is not the same as what we perceive long term. And tourism has become a very important way for people to be able to tell these stories in a situation in which otherwise it would have been impossible.
Thank you. And what really bringing the two previous presentations together, I think what really has struck me is that role of very specific places and the connection that you have with northeastern Japan, and Michaela has with Niagara Falls, and trying to understand these really global issues through this connection to place. So thank you so much for sharing your work today over many years, 10 years now. Now we're going to move to a short activity that's going to be facilitated by Ian and Lucia. So I'll pass back to Ian and Lucia now to introduce the activity.
Thanks, Anna. And thank you, Anna Martini. That was fabulous. I'm really sort of fascinated by that presentation. Thank you. Okay, in terms of an activity, then please chip in, Lucia. But we basically wanted to do something that meant you weren't just sitting there listening to us waffle. So the idea was to ask you to share something that either tourism or mobilities or mobility justice meant to you. I brought a couple of things because I can never settle on any one thing. One is a caterpillar that was knitted by my other half called Katie. Here she is. And the reason I brought that was, for me, mobility is about changing and about adapting and evolving, and how you grow into something new because of your mobility. So that sort of represented that. The other thing I bought was a book. It could have been any book on the bookshelf in front of me, which you can't see, because again, journeys are about growth and about learning and about listening. It's not simply, for me, mobility is not simply about observing. It is about how it changes you. And so what's interesting is, for me, is the stories we attach to the artifacts. And it's a technique I've used in a few research projects where I've asked people to bring an artifact and to share their story so that we can start to unpack personally what those stories mean to us, to the point where you may bring an object and you may talk about it, and by the end of talking about it, you may feel that the object no longer has that resonance. So what we'd like, having had me share a couple of my artifacts, is for you through the chat to share some of the artifacts that you brought, and maybe just a sentence about why you brought that artifact, that sound, that song, that quotation with you, so that we can then share, maybe just select 2 or 3 of them that we can share and maybe provoke a conversation between us as panelists, reflecting on how what you've presented to us has an effect on us. How does that sound?
So the idea is that you describe it on the chat, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly, I think that is a kickoff one after the one of Ian that was shared with us earlier today. So it's a quote.
Do you have access to it, Lucia? I don't have access to it here.
What do you mean? Sorry, Ian?
Do you have access to the quote?
Yeah, it's appearing on the screen. I think Anna or Emmy.
Oh, yes.
Is here. So basically, I think the things are visible for all of us in the screen. So this is the quote that's been shared with us earlier as part of these activities. So anyone else had something? Maybe you can add mine. I don't know, sounds maybe not so original, but I've been discussing it with Ian. For me, and it's not an object, of course, but would have been my dog. Charming, something that connects me with the idea of mobility as a walk with a dog or traveling with a dog, since it gives me his perspective, his way, and looking at the surroundings, what scares him, what excited him. So actually, that is to me something that makes me think on being on the move. Of course, I can also sleep many hours, but in the couch. But that would have been something that would come to my mind, not as an object. On top, beside the idea of music, having always music, something that, so to say, disconnect me actually when I'm moving around. That's intermeaning of keeping me in my emotions, so to say, or sparking some emotion. Not really. Yeah, that's where my.
Do you curate that music? Do you have certain music for certain journeys, or?
Not really. I think I have music that reminds me of a different moment of my life, singer-songwriter. So I tend to go more in that kind of traveling in time, not only in space, by connecting with certain types of playlists or albums, depending on the mood or the destination also.
Okay. And what is it about music that you feel is so important to you when it comes to mobility?
Yeah, I don't know. Tough questions. Honestly, before this webinar, I would have not think on that. So probably it's the connection with emotions. We are used to travel in such a more accepted, but more functional way. And to me, the music is always a way to connect with something more emotional, I would say. Yeah, I mean, instinctually would reply that. That is true. That sounds also awful, especially after the presentation that we gave, when I mentioned that actually the music keeps you a bit in your own thoughts and bubble, which is the opposite of what we presented. So forgive me here. But I think exactly this connection maybe more with emotions side of the thing, emotional side of the thing. Yeah.
Anna, you said you have something to share.
Yes, it's very much mundane, but I thought when you explained the exercise, I actually thought, wait, I have it just here, about my sparkling water.
Okay.
Which is, so I agree with Lucia, it's mostly about emotions when we think about mobilities and when we think about the things that really make us feel when we are on the move, etc. So the story is very simple. When I started going to Japan back in 2015, there was no sparkling water. They didn't know what sparkling water was. And I don't like sodas. I just like some fizzy water.
Mm-hmm.
So year after year, I kept going to Japan and I kept wishing for that. And at some point, tourism mobilities became so prominent in Japan. Now it's an all-time high, and they're having a lot of problems with over-tourism, actually. And suddenly, 3 years ago, sparkling water appeared in Japan at the supermarket. So I know it's silly, but for me, affectively, I felt like, okay, the world is really global. And also, in a sense, it made me think about what tourism can do, because, of course, that was not a desire of the Japanese. I'm sorry, I can hear some weird noise, but I don't know what's happening. And that is just something, yes, that tourism does help also the logistics and the sharing of resources for good and bad, of course. So, yeah, thank you for the exercise, though.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear your thoughts, and particularly thinking through the role of materiality here and how we kind of connect our affect and emotion to our kind of travel experiences. So thanks so much for sharing, Anna, and to Ian and Lucia for facilitating our activity. We've had a number of questions come in. So our first is from Monica, who asks, Sorry, Amy. Okay, sorry. I'm going to go with this one from Kath then, since it's up on the screen. So Kath asks, or notes, for me, platforms like Google Maps and TripAdvisor shape how we move through places via routes, reviews, and rankings, while also pushing hospitality work towards visibility and platform metrics. So that's just a comment from Kath. I don't know if anybody wants to come in and make a comment on that, and then we'll move to our questions.
If I can just say that I think maps are very powerful. Just thinking about the maps that MK showed us of the space and how they sort of represent a palimpsest of how things have changed over time, and how relationships change over time. I think I find maps very moving, particularly when you, as I say, when you look at them historically and look at those transitions.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And next we have a question from Michael Humbrack, who, in reference to Michaela's presentation, really nice, Michaela, thank you. What do you think ambivalent methodologies can help us learn in terms of experiences of tourism injustice?
I love this because I'm kind of like thinking about it right now. So my answer is going to be like kind of situated and partial, like all these other ones are. So I've been mostly thinking about ambivalence through Lauren Berlant specifically, and kind of this condition of inevitable attachment and what that means for living and working in the places that we live and work. And I see that come up in Niagara Falls in a lot of ways, where I'm researching a city and doing work in a city, living in a city, and trying to exist in the way I do in a city that has many dual kind of like many narratives about it, about how it's spectacular or about how it's a city that's already in ruin. And I think that maybe this kind of speaks to some of the other kind of tensions that have been coming up with other questions around what does it mean to be like situated in inevitable attachment. And so there's many things here. We are situated within our own located histories. We are situated within the world as it's structured by settler colonialism, which is like the access to land is what undergirds the production of materials and the production of systems of capitalism that we live with under. So all of that kind of work is that we're trying in our kind of partial ways to attend to all of these different factors that make and continue to make and contribute to life for different types of people and different types of places on Earth. And I think this sort of like ambivalent condition is part of locating all of these different types of productive forces at once, right? So affective forces, material forces, societal forces, and all of these different parts. So I think sometimes, and I'm sorry, I'm thinking on the fly here. I think sometimes what we see is that when we talk about how it feels to do research and why it's important to focus on feeling, is that a lot of times that becomes simplified where either the researcher in potentially other research modes is asked to step back from the way of from like how they're doing the research in a way where they're removing themselves, or when we're situated, our type of feeling is simplified in a different mode. When all of these things, we're allowed to have feelings about what we do. It's allowed to be hard to do the work that we do. We're allowed to be affected and see other people affected by the types of structures that we live within. And we can do small amounts of work to reveal how different kind of structures and forces are the things that allow other things to happen. And I know that's like kind of messy, but this is what I'm trying to get at, is an ambivalent research methodology allows for a lot of these forces in tension and allows for us to be situated, impartial, and attuned to larger forces that are often deeply violent and deeply conducive of, or sorry, like conditioning how we're able to do the work that we do in tourism. And I think like doing work in the places that we live is always hard, and we have to recognize that it's hard, and we do the best that we can. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michaela. Does either Ian or Anna feel free to jump in here and share any reflections you have on your own work in terms of thinking about ambivalent methodologies and the challenges of how you approach the work that you do?
Part of my background is in performing arts and theatre, so I always like to have some kind of performative element in any kind of research I do, so that it becomes an entertainment as well as a learning space. And using that as a provocation to trigger people to think, maybe in ways that they hadn't considered that they would think before they joined the research. So it's very much a sharing and very much a creative process.
Yes, I guess for me, it's more understanding that, well, in my specific case, being a white person situated in northeastern Japan already creates ambivalence in my research. Of course, it took me years to understand that when people answer to my question, the answers are already ambivalent, and it led me to sort of become more creative also with my methodologies. So to understand, for example, that whenever I'm given an answer, I'm given that answer because I am a foreigner, not I'm given the truth despite being a foreigner. And so I started to see where that could lead me. And I understood that if used well, actually there's more that people are willing to say to someone they don't know or that looks radically different rather than their neighbors. And I spent, for example, this past year, I spent a lot of time in Japan. I did not collect interviews. I just spent time planting flowers with people in the community because that's what they do in the spring. And so in that sense, for me, that's not being ambivalent. They always know that I'm a researcher. They always know that I'm writing articles, but there is always that ambivalence because you enter personal relations with these people and you cannot prescinde from that. So I really support what Michaela said. We do the best that we can. And what we can do is just understand that the process is much murkier and complicated than we think or that we can understand.
Thank you so much. We've had quite a few reflections come in from the activity, and whilst we don't have time to go back to it now, they are going to be all available and collated on the YouTube recording, so we can visit that as panelists and as the audience to share how that activity has unfolded beyond us as panelists. So now we're going to move to another question from the audience, which asks, what initially led you to working with more than human approaches, and why have they stayed important to your work? I'll pass that to Ian first, if that's okay, Ian.
Of course, thank you. Right. Okay, so my interest began because I was teaching within the School of Events Management and Event Studies, but my background was philosophy. So I began by challenging the concept of event, and that led me into looking at events very differently, looking at events in terms of disruption, rupture, and how those ruptures within routines express relationships of power, express relationships of manipulation. And that pushed me towards using protest and event as a kind of paradigmatic model. And from there, I became more interested in the more than human aspects of dissent and protest and how that manifests. So it was sort of quite a sideways move into looking at more than human aspects. One that looks at mobility and event and tourism as a landscape and a terrain to be explored. And it's an ever-changing and ever-growing and evolving landscape. And so it's something that I don't think I could ever let go of, because every time I think I've got my head around even the smallest part of it, something different happens. And I realize that I haven't really understood anything at all, and I need to start again, which is exciting.
And it's been really nice as someone who has worked in events to follow your work over the years and see those kind of threads unfold. So it's really nice to see that.
It led me into all sorts of interesting corners. I'm currently working in death studies with a colleague based in Belgium. I've worked in fandom studies with colleagues elsewhere, and I just like to see where it takes me. I don't want to put any boundaries on it.
Michaela, I mean, you shared a little bit of this through your presentation. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I guess just to add the briefest amount, I was mostly exposed to thinking with these different bodies of work initially because before I'm an academic, I'm a rock climber. And so learning about the way that the world is constituted and the world is constructed in part came not from the academy, but from my practice of climbing. Climbers talk about climbing with rocks and being led by the landscape. So in a very kind of straightforward way, that's sort of where it came from. And then that language was and kind of maybe quite esoteric approach of how climbers speak was I was able to read a lot and have some supplemented give it some more academic language than just what we get in climbing, and I've kind of progressed from there to different modes of infrastructural thinking that not are just focused on trees and rocks and the outside, but are focused on all of these different types of things like property registers and archives and who maintains those and all of those different types of agencies. So maybe just like an attention to more than human agency was where it started.
It's really interesting how your kind of everyday experiences, you actually found kind of a language for that in academia, but it was kind of already there in your worldview.
I like that idea of being with the rock.
Yes, very much.
Awesome.
And Anna, Claudia?
Yes. By the way, I was reading Michaela's chapter on rock climbing because I'm also a rock climber, so that was really fascinating. Would recommend. And no, I guess for me it started because of my whole PhD and my whole trajectory is based on affect studies. So in that sense, it came naturally. And a few years ago, I was actually teaching the posthuman geography course. So it's sort of built upon that. And I've never actually published anything on the posthuman, but affect is always the undercurrent or the straight out theoretical framework of everything I've written so far in academia. So yes, that's basically that.
Huge thank you. We're coming to the end of our time here today. I've really valued the thoughts and reflections and learning more about the work of our colleagues that work in this kind of more than human effect space within tourism. So a huge thank you to Ian and Lucia. Lucia had to leave a little bit earlier, but a huge thank you to Lucia, then Michaela and Anna Claudia as well. We've really valued your contributions, and thanks so much for being part of this seminar today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Anna. Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers. Enjoy the
Thank
rest
you.
of your day, everyone.